Welcome to the session on diet. This is the biggie. This is really a topic that all my clients have a great fascination with. This isn't really very surprising because as females we're quite complicated creatures because of our hormonal state or the fluctuations in those hormones. So we're going to be discussing menstruation and diet and how to work around the hormones as they fluctuate through that menstrual cycle. Of course, there are some cases in which women won't menstruate, and we'll deal with those too. I'm going to talk about the keto diet or the keto approach because we're going to be using that at various phases through that menstrual cycle. And for those who don't menstruate, depending on the reason you don't menstruate, it would be a very valuable tool to use, and we'll be discussing how to use it and when to use it. This particular approach for me has proven over the 32 years that I've been doing this, has proven to be one of the most successful because I think we live in a world that's just inundated with very high calorie, nutrient empty foods, specifically carbohydrates. And so just adhering to a keto approach is one way to manage what we're exposed to better. Alternatively, for those who don't want to go the keto approach, we will look at the low carb, high fat approach. We'll also look at intermittent fasting. It's a great tool. I've had much success with that. And then putting it all together to ensure that it is going to work for you, to keep you lean and to keep you healthy. Moving into our section on menstruation and diet, as I mentioned, the keto approach is, I think, a very valuable one. So we're going to be discussing exactly why it is so valuable at certain times through the menstrual cycle. And we'll also be looking at the menstrual cycle because it's very valuable for you to understand what happens when in terms of those hormones, then looking at what happens during that cycle with regard to how the body tends to store fat and how we can avoid that. And then we'll be discussing what you could be doing if you are not menstruating. So why is it that I'm suggesting the keto approach? Well, as I mentioned, and as you know, we experience quite large fluctuations in hormones through our menstrual cycle. And these hormones are intimately linked to fat storage. So if we're aware of those phases that those hormones go through, and if we can understand how that's linked to the storing of body fat, it then makes it much easier to manage not picking up weight through a month with this in mind. Just to elaborate, at certain points in the menstrual cycle, our estrogen is low, which makes us more prone to storing more body fat because we become more insulin resistant in that period, and we'll discuss this in detail. So a keto approach during the phases where the estrogen is quite low, and that's around about 2/3 of our cycle, amounts to about 20 days, more or less. This reduces the chances of storing excess body fat. Looking at the menstrual cycle phases, the menstrual phase is obviously when we get our period, and that can last anywhere between 3 and 7 days. And at this time, estrogen and progesterone levels have dropped. The follicular phase starts at the end of the menstrual phase, and that carries on until ovulation. And during this phase, follicle-stimulating hormone is released by the pituitary gland. Ovulation then marks the end of the follicular phase, and that lasts anywhere between 12 and 48 hours. And in a 28-day cycle, ovulation will occur around about day 14. But of course, you might not have a 28-day cycle, so day of ovulation may be different. I know that my cycle has always been quite a short one, so around 23 days. And so I had to become quite adept at understanding when I was ovulating, because that then gave me an idea of where to apply a dietary protocol accordingly. So you may want to do a little bit of work around that in terms of establishing when you are ovulating. Progesterone rises along with estrogen in the luteal phase. That runs from around day 15 to day 28. Gradually, towards the end of that, both progesterone and estrogen drop until menstruation occurs again. Because progesterone and estrogen affect the hormones that regulate water retention, often at this point we'll experience that increased water retention, bloating, maybe decreased serotonin, which can lead to irritability, lowered mood, brain fog, and all those things that we're very aware of at that time. Now, when you look at this graph in terms of the menstrual cycle phases, you can see that estrogen, well, the hormones have risen just before ovulation, and so they peak just prior to ovulation and during ovulation. And then there's a drop-off, but a second peak just before menstruation happens again. And so we're going to be looking at those are the times where we're going to be applying some carbohydrate and a bit of freedom in those phases. So again, we'll discuss this in more detail, but it's quite useful to understand that to start with. And so when estrogen is low, when the hormones are low, estrogen and progesterone are low, that's when we need to think about bringing in a much lower carb approach, whether it's keto, whether it's low carb, because that's the point at which we're going to be resisting using the sugar or the glucose itself from the carbohydrates. So in any given meal that has carbohydrate in it, some form of carbohydrate, let's assume that it's something that's got some starch in it so that it actually impacts on blood sugar. The carbohydrate will increase blood sugar levels. High blood sugar leads to insulin being released, which helps the cells use glucose for energy. So if you're consuming let's say a meal with some potato or rice or some kind of starchy food, you'll be releasing insulin, and that will help the cells to pull all the glucose or the sugar into them to use as energy. However, when our estrogen levels are lower, we actually become insulin resistant. So when insulin arrives at the cell doors and in essence says to the cells, look, can you take this fuel? I need to get rid of the sugar. Have you got room for it? Because our estrogen levels are so low, it's almost as if overnight we become insulin, it's almost as if we become diabetic, because that low estrogen results in a resistance to hearing insulin's knock on the door. In other words, we need more of it to hear the knock. We're not likely to be able to take all that glucose into the cells because we're just not sensitive enough to the message that insulin is giving. And that, of course, then results in high blood sugar because we're not able to take the sugar out of the blood and put it into the cells. It's left in the blood. And that means that whatever glucose is left there is likely to convert and be stored in the fat cells as excess body fat. Okay, so the concept is very simple. The technical aspects might be a little bit more difficult to understand, but basically speaking, it goes like this. Because estrogen has come down, it makes us more insulin resistant. All that means is that if we put in the same amount of carbohydrates we always used to put in, we are going to convert much more of that carbohydrate into body fat. What if you have no menstrual cycle? If you don't experience your period because of extreme weight loss or disordered eating, I personally, and I've worked a lot with clients with disordered eating over the years, particularly with young adults and teenagers, and actually in some cases much older adults, older women, should I say. But my strong suggestion is that you focus on really good quality, high nutrient foods, particularly fat, because it's just such a great provider of energy and it's clean in the sense that our mitochondria work very well with it, and we'll be discussing this further on in this particular talk. moderate amounts of carbohydrates and proteins. But I really, really strongly advise you not to use apps, not to weigh your food, not to calorie count, nothing that externalizes your diet from learning how to do it from a more intuitive, instinctive way. And we will be talking about that when we come to the food language tutorial. And I also wouldn't employ intermittent fasting. The chances of it potentially becoming utilized in a more rigid way are very high. And I think that it's really important to back away from that if you know that you have a pattern of disordered eating. Early or medical menopause, I would recommend then that you look at the keto cycling with intermittent fasting, and we'll be talking about how you keto cycle. Any other medical condition, you might want to consider low carb, high fat approach, unless of course someone is specifically one of your medical practitioners or functional health practitioners has said to you it's not a good idea. And test shorter intermittent fasting periods. So we'll be talking about intermittent fasting and your ideal time frame for that, but I would suggest that you go shorter rather than longer on those intermittent fasts, certainly to begin with and to experiment with. If pregnant and breastfeeding, I would focus again on high quality foods at all meals, no intermittent fasting. Keto works quite well for some pregnant women. I was relatively keto through mine, but I think this is very important to experiment. And I wouldn't want to say that one thing is better than another, because I think it depends entirely on your system. And the one thing you have to watch for with both those is that you are fueling a second little person. And so it's not a good idea to withhold nutrients. Right, so then there's the issue of hormonal contraceptives, because of course these impact on our menstrual cycle. Typically the pill creates an artificial menstrual cycle in the sense that what it does is keeps you in a state of mimicking pregnancy for the 3 weeks of the on period. In other words, where the pill you're taking is active, it's actively delivering the hormones. And then there's a week of what they call breakthrough bleeding, which looks like a period. This means that no ovulation will occur. So estrogen and progesterone levels are steady for the 3 weeks that the pill is delivering the hormones. And because there's no fluctuation in specifically estrogen for these 3 weeks, you aren't looking to necessarily change anything in terms of chasing the levels of estrogen, but what you want to do is sustain some sort of approach that's going to result in you remaining healthy and lean at the same time. So you could experiment with either doing the keto cycling, so say 3 days on, 1 day off, 3 days on, 1 day off for those 3 weeks, and then do your keto and intermittent fasting during the week of your breakthrough period. And we'll be discussing this in detail as we come through this tutorial, but I'm just laying it out here so that you have a sense of what your options are. You can always come back to this section and just remind yourself of it once we've dealt with exactly what keto and intermittent fasting are. Or you could potentially do the low carb, high fat approach, which is a more gentle approach, and then you could do your keto with intermittent fasting again during that week of bleeding. So I would experiment a little bit, see what takes your fancy, test it, and see what works best for you. Everyone is so different, it's hard to know, and obviously without someone sitting in front of me, this is a fairly generic approach to this, and so you need to be willing to experiment a little bit and test things yourself. Just a note to say that the hormonal IUD can cause lighter or irregular periods. So again, you're going to have to think about how you want to approach it, but you might want to experiment with low carb, high fat again. As I've said before, this is a gentler approach. So I think probably experimentation is what's required if you are on any kind of hormonal contraceptive, because your body is going to respond probably fairly differently to the person next to you, and so you're going to need to work out your own particular formula in this regard. We're going to move on to looking at the keto diet and just what it is about, the benefits, talking about mitochondria inside the cells and why they're important, all the bits and pieces related to keto that promote good health, becoming adapted to fat and what that means from a leanness point of view, the importance of keto cycling. This is something that a lot of people don't seem to appreciate. So many people come into keto just doing it 24/7, and they don't realize that there are very important reasons not to do it 24/7, and we'll be discussing those. But it's really important to cycle on and off a keto diet. So in other words, move in and out of ketosis. Potential dangers of long-term keto. There's a caution for certain risk groups, so we'll be talking through that. And then finally looking at what does a keto diet look like? What denotes a keto diet in terms of the ratios of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats? You'll remember the old food pyramid, I'm sure, where we were told that we needed rather a lot of carbohydrate. So it was a particularly high carb and particularly low fat guideline with moderate levels of protein. And what a keto food pyramid looks like is the exact reverse of that. It's based on a larger amount of fat, a much smaller amount of carbohydrate, and protein is still moderate. So protein is the only group that remains where it was, which is in the middle. I find often actually when clients come to see me or when people are talking to me about keto, that they have misunderstood it to be a high protein diet, which it isn't. In fact, on keto, look, we're going to talk through ways to work out exactly what your protein needs are, but a keto diet is a moderate to low protein diet. It's a high fat, low carbohydrate diet. How does it work? The old school reliance of carbohydrates for fuel meant that the body was generally going to be very much more rapidly storing body fat, or more easily storing glucose or excess carbohydrates as body fat in the fat cells. This is because if you've been consuming a lot of carbohydrates, your body will be, in essence, it will be designed, adapted to utilizing carbohydrates as a primary source of fuel. That means that it's not very adept at utilizing stored fat as fuel, or even fatty acids. It's going to be very familiar with the use of carbohydrates as the primary driver. So what we need to do is we want to take you into becoming fat adapted. So you have to go through a process to become fat adapted, which will then allow us to access the stored body fat that you've got and start to utilize that as the primary source of fuel. In other words, fatty acids as a primary source of fuel rather than carbohydrates. But it is a process that needs to be gone through in order for your body to be able to make that adaptation. So you can't expect it to become fat adapted without forcing it to become fat adapted. Keto depletes the body's glucose reserves, breaking down fats as a preferred energy supply. This is a very beneficial thing. You want to, in essence, it means that your body becomes much swifter or more efficient or better at using any stored body fat as a source of fuel, because it can swiftly make that conversion from fats into energy. So the process of depleting these glucose reserves, breaking down fats as this preferred energy source, means that it produces something called ketones. Hence, it's called the keto diet. We're producing ketones. You start using ketones as a primary source of fuel. And once you do that, you're considered to be fat adapted. So you can see there's a bit of a process, as I said, of in adapting, becoming adapted to fat, but the benefits speak for themselves, I think. Here are your benefits of keto. So increasing fat loss, improving energy levels. This is a big one. Reducing cravings and blood sugar levels is fantastic. The consequences are enormous there. Reduces inflammation, acne, polycystic ovarian syndrome symptoms. It protects brain function. It improves focus and mental clarity, reduces blood pressure, seizures, lowers the risk of chronic disease, including some cancers, raises vitamin B3 levels. And that's an important one, because as we get older, our B levels in particular, but B3 specifically, levels are reduced. And it's anti-aging. So who doesn't want those benefits? Do you remember the mitochondria from school biology? The little organelle that sits inside the cell, inside the fuel cells, and it's responsible for converting all nutrients into energy. So all food, all drink, anything that's got a nutrient value, it has to convert that into energy. If the mitochondria aren't working properly, it can have a profound impact on tissues, systems, organs. The consequence of that can be muscle weakness, diabetes, hearing and vision loss, kidney failure, dementia, certain cancers, and the increased risk of age-related disorders. So things like heart disorder or disease, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. A keto diet increases the number of mitochondria in the body and also promotes greater use of oxygen in the production of energy. So more mitochondria, more energy. A keto diet also promotes heart health. It lowers triglyceride levels. Now, high levels equate to an increased risk of heart disease, so you always want lower triglyceride levels. It increases your high-density lipoproteins. And by the way, we're going to be dealing with cholesterol in another session, so we'll talk very briefly here. So it increases your high-density lipoproteins, which reduces your risk of heart disease. So you always want high levels of high-density lipoproteins. It produces better particle size of the low-density lipoproteins, and larger particles equal a lower risk of heart conditions. And we'll be talking about, as I mentioned, about particle size within the context of your cholesterol. But a keto diet also decreases the number of low-density lipoprotein particles, so that's massively beneficial. And in essence, it improves your overall heart health picture. How do we adapt to fat? You need to take your body through a very specific phase of moving from utilizing carbs to using fats. And for some people, it can be a mildly unpleasant process. It takes a few weeks, and ideally you want to stay below around 30 to 50 grams of total carbs minus the fiber value. So I've given you an image here to show you where your total carb value is, and then your fiber content. And if you subtract your fiber content from your carbs, it gives you your net carbs. And you need to be doing that for every day for around about 2 to 4 weeks. So you really want to go through that period. And you may get these carb flu symptoms. I didn't ever get them myself, but I have had some clients who've experienced it. And you might experience things like poor energy, poor sleep, mental and exercise performance. So you just might not feel great in those ways. You might be a little bit more hungry. You might not be very comfortable digestively. You might experience some nausea. I'm not a big one to recommend keto strips for the same reason I spoke about not using apps to check on carb levels or protein levels, except in the initial instances, just as a general guideline. I just think that it keeps us a little too narrowly focused on values. And I think that really, as I've said, what I want to do here is to try and draw out your intuition, your instinct around food, and to start to get you to trust that again. You know, as women, we've been confounded our whole lives by various industries that take advantage, I think, of our insecurities. And so we are massive targets for whether it's food, whether it's diet industry or it's beauty or exercise industry, I think that there's a danger that that if we start to get too focused on the numbers, we can get sucked into a diet mentality very easily. And so I would like to keep things a little bit looser and just have you internally check and think about symptoms you're experiencing or things that you're aware of as a response to what you're doing, rather than using an app or using an external evaluator of what it is you're doing. Better energy and endurance will suggest that you've gotten through this period of adapting from carbs to fat. Loss of body fat, so you start to notice that you're dropping some body fat. Fewer and less intense cravings. And cravings, by the way, are very intimately linked to diets that are too low in fat. So the higher they become in fat, typically speaking, the less cravings you have. And also your mind should be clear and focused, and that will tell you that you've gone through this adaptation phase. So I've said before that it's not a good idea to do keto 24/7, and the reason for that is because a keto diet is a famine diet. And so if you consider that back in caveman days we would have perhaps found a woolly mammoth every now and then, we would have gorged ourselves on that feast. We would have had a feast, and we would have made sure we took as much of it in as we could, and perhaps carried as much of it with us as we could. But there would have been days, if not weeks, that would go by without that level of feast. And so we would swing back and forth between this feast and famine state. And in fact, what that does at a cellular level is it enhances our metabolic sharpness. So it's very beneficial to the mitochondria to go through that challenge of feast and famine. And in fact, we come out much stronger the other side of a challenge like that. So it's hugely beneficial to the mitochondria themselves in terms of withstanding stress at that cellular level. Keto is a famine diet, and we're going to be talking about intermittent fasting. And fasting is also a famine state. So we need to feast. We need to bring in feasts. We have to practically bring those in ourselves. So if you're doing keto for more than 3 months, you could start by doing it for 3 months, because that will give you an easy way to drop the weight, start to feel a bit more like yourself again, know that you're putting in place some really fantastic benefits. But then we need to come out of that and we need to spend 2 or 3 days on keto, followed by 1 high carb day. And that high carb, depending on your activity levels, could be just over 50 grams up to 200 grams. I typically will give clients a protocol of 3 days on keto, 1 day on high carb, 3 days on keto. So in any given week, you've got 1 day of high carb. And if you're very active, then you could take that carb level all the way up. Females do need to eat enough well-timed carbs, because we are very, very sensitive to caloric restriction because of our hormone levels. For women of fertile age, the potential dangers of long-term ketosis are, I think, personally, I think more severe. Actually, it depends on you and how sensitive your body is, to be fair. So things like interference with mucus lining, function of the gut bacteria, impact on the thyroid, the consequence of that is brain fog and fatigue, reduced estradiol, increased estrogen leading to fat storage and cortisol. When we talk about long-term ketosis, I guess we're talking over 3 months of strict keto with none of that carb cycling. And remember, I've suggested that 3 months is the longest period you should go on a strict keto. And at that point, you should start to bring in your higher carbs and cycle in and out of that. Personally, I think that a low-carb diet, as opposed to a keto diet, might be a solution to the potential danger of the long-term ketosis, simply just because it's a gentler approach. But I guess the bottom line is, if you're going to do keto, and you want to do it flat out for 3 months to see what sort of effect it has on the body, go for it. After that, definitely cycle in and out of keto. If you know yourself to be a little bit of a slower mover, you might want to go with a low carb, high fat approach. And as I say, we'll be talking about what that looks like. Keto can also reduce insulin because as you bring those carb levels down, of course, you're not going to be producing enough insulin. And so some of the dangers around, again, this long-term keto diet are that you might consistently reduce insulin. And insulin is a very necessary hormone. You can see it's important in protein absorption in the muscles. It's important for thyroid function and hormone regulation. It's vital for bone and central nervous system health and for immunity. Type 2 diabetics, if you're taking a sodium glucose co-transporter 2 inhibitor, that's a mouthful, make sure you chat to your GP before doing keto, because the combination, we know that we don't want anyone experiencing ketoacidosis, which is basically an increase in acidity in the blood, which can be fatal. So that's not something you want to mess around with. If you don't have a gallbladder, you might want to use something like MCT, which is a medium chain triglyceride. It's absorbed faster, so it's much easier to digest. You could decide to take a digestive enzyme and maybe ox bile to help with the gallbladder function. Well, to help the liver deal with the fact that there is no gallbladder. You might want to take stomach acid support and also just be slow about going into a keto diet. I would go low carb, high fat, and then gently move yourself into keto, because if you don't have a gallbladder, it puts a lot of pressure on the liver to manage your fat levels. And if you don't metabolize or utilize fats, so for those with a familial history of high cholesterol, keto is probably not the best approach for you, and you might want to look at a low carb, high fat approach instead. What do those daily keto ratios look like? There's a plate of food giving you an idea. Carbs would be around 5 to 10% of your calories. I've just put a little note here that 1 gram is worth 4 calories, just to give you an idea. So 30 grams of carbs is about 120 calories. Now, I don't want us counting calories. So the last thing I want to do is to get us into a frame of mind where we're counting calories, or we're weighing food, or we're, whatever it is we're doing. We don't want to be going into that counting, weighing place. I'm being as sciencey as I can to give you more rather than less information. I'm trying to create an overall picture of what it is we're trying to do here. So I'm giving you these values to help you understand what it all looks like to begin with. We will be going into understanding your own unique food response language, because your body has a language, and that will allow us to become a lot more intuitive, a lot more instinctive about our choices. That's where we're going to hone the skill of starting to listen to the body and make adjustments accordingly, rather than, as I say, looking at calorie counting or any of that. So this is just here for the sciencey bit, but we don't ever want to be counting calories. Fats, you want around 70 to 80% of your calories to come from that. So it's a very, very large component on a keto diet. 1 gram of fat is 9 calories, so it's double the value that carbohydrates and proteins are. And 1 tablespoon will give you around about 100 calories. Again, just so that you know more or less what that looks like. Protein should make up around 20 to 25% of your overall calories. As I've said, 1 gram is 4 calories, which is the same as carbohydrate. So as an example, your 250 gram steak will give you around 550 calories of protein.